we welcome you once again to this valuable and fairly rare opportunity to gather in person for the ICCRP, because we are an intergenerational research partnership involving children and older people on 5 continents. So we do pretty much everything virtually. So that's why this is so special and rare, and I'm so excited to see you all in person. So for more information, I encourage you to check out our website, which I will share the link of with you all shortly. So we are going to have our 3 speakers, and I will introduce each of them in turn just before they speak. And we're going to have Irene and George and Robert in that order, and they will have 20 minutes each to contribute. And then we will open up the floor for dialogue together. So get your questions and comments ready. We will ask you to keep those to a minimum to maximize the opportunity for dialogue together, because there's going to be a lot of dialogue, I think, right? So the fabulous Irene Rizzini will start us off. She will be focusing on Brazil. Irene Rizzini is a professor at the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, PUC-Rio, and also the director and founder of the International Centre for Research and Policy on Childhood, fondly known by the acronym of CS. She serves on the board of several organizations at national and international level, and she's published extensively on issues related to human rights, public policies focusing on children and young people and their families, and community context. She has conducted studies on children and a variety of topics on childhood studies and children's rights, including children and youth in institutions, living and working on the streets, young people's activism, and their right to participation. The floor is yours, Nanima.
It's so nice to be here with you this morning. As Sarah said, we have been interacting online far too long. And this is a project that lasts for several years, which is really a precious thing, because we know very well, very often, when we really get engaged in the research and in the interaction, particularly with young people, time is over. Right? So this is good, and also a network that has allowed us to form very precious friendships. So I'm coming from Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. My name is Irene Rizzini, and I have been a professor for many, many years, a researcher, and I would say an activist as well, since we have really concentrated our work both to provide information, data on university-based spaces, what CSP is, where we can bring together all kinds of people, disciplines, generations with more freedom, and also the goal to promote social change. That's our commitment, and I believe very important to our network, ICCRP as well. So that's where I come from. I am originally a psychologist, a sociologist, and very trained and in public policy as well. So I think a combination of disciplines that helped us do the work we really want to do in several areas. So I prepared something considering the 20 minutes I have, and I don't get lost after so many years of work. So I'll be moving a little bit here. Tara talked about our network. So I'm going to focus in part in the work we have been doing through this network with so many countries involved, I guess, about 20 countries, right? Mm-hmm. Mine starts, go very slowly. Okay, here very quickly is what I'll be addressing today. We don't have to read all this because I'll go one by one.
very, very basic facts, so you have a little bit of a sense of the dimension of my country, and I think George will be able to expand that to our continent, the Latin American region and the Caribbean. And here we are talking about one large area. We are in the north of America, but we are in the south. But we have so many points in common in our histories, also a lot of specificities, and I hope to be able to address today some of them. Brazil is a country of over 200 million people. As you can see, we have a lot of young people in Brazil. So we used to say that Brazil is a young country, rich in childhood still. That has been changing. We have smaller and smaller families, as is the international, I think, global trend, but still a huge number of young people. Brazil is extremely unequal in terms of its socioeconomic characteristics, and it's actually, George might confirm that, I think Brazil is still one of the 5 most unequal countries in the world, with huge implications for children's well-being. Currently, we are in a good wave, meaning that we have a administration, political administration, that is receptive to human rights, to children's rights. That has not always been the case. I do not have the time to go through important aspects of our history where we can see that Brazil is a very centralized country in terms of its power and non-democratic most of the time, or with which helps, I think, to sustain this very unequal aspect of Brazil. So a fragile democracy. So when we talk about crianças e menores, I don't know if that really can be easily translated as children, as minors. And a lot of the work I have been doing through ICCRP as well in our publications, Tara and I have been involved in working on several publications together. We have been looking at how hard it is to translate certain terms. They simply don't mean the same. When we say minors in Brazil, I don't think it's what you read. We are talking about a whole history and process of discrimination of young people because they were poor, they were black, they came from slavery, families that were slaves, and they are probably even often seen as not being human. So that's what I mean by minors, but the whole concept of minors was really present in the first steps towards public policy in Brazil, which was the first policy in the passage of the 19th to the 20th century. It was a policy for the social assistance and protection of minors, which really meant 2 aspects. One, that was very important, was the idea that children had to have its own legislation. That only happened in 1927 with our first Code of Minors. There is in Brazil a lot of criticism against the Code of Minors, but in fact it was the first law that allowed children to be protected in spaces that were meant for them, instead of, for example, being put in prisons with adults, or the homicides, etc. So this was important. At the same time, the whole idea, and I would love that if you want to explore in some of our writings, the history of child welfare in Brazil is that it promoted the idea that children had to be, the poor children, the minors, had to be taken out of the family settings because those families were no good, they were incapable of protecting or educating their children to be good citizens, meaning, as Foucault would say, very docile, obedient, and not contesting anything. And so the practice that became really important at the time, the solution that also happened in Canada and other countries, was to institutionalize them. The whole history of residential care here in Canada, in the US, the children who were orphans or just very poor after the wars in the UK, sent to Australia or to all the colonies, is the same ideology that these children would be put in another space where they would be modeled, they would be trained to serve the country in those terms, really not ascending in terms of social mobility, but being able to be used as workers. So the practice of institutionalizing children became, we even call it a culture because that was the solution, that was the idea. So what you can see in these pictures, in the first one, you can see one of the institutions that are, the kids are almost like little soldiers in huge orphanages. They were not orphans. And only with the children's law, the statute on the child and the adolescent in 1890, we were able to really contest this, to say, these children are not orphans. They have families. They have extensive families. They were basically poor. I also brought one from the Amazonian region in Brazil, because that's where we have a larger concentration of indigenous children, that I thought that perhaps you would see some similarity in terms of places where children were trained as workers, coming, taken from the indigenous families as well to residential care. Then I say, well, is it care really? It is residential for sure. So jumping in history here, the whole idea of children, minors becoming citizens, is a real huge jump in history here, because I am jumping several decades to get to the 90s, to say that we only in the 80s, right after the approval of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so that decade has a lot to teach us. And one of which I am emphasizing here, which is the whole idea that minors were not minors, they were children and they were entitled to rights, they were sujeitos de direitos, they were subject of rights. You can imagine how hard it still is to really change the mentality that says, well, yeah, they're on the streets, they are nothing, they are perhaps human, but they are not useful. Yeah, that idea is still there, and also the fact that those families are still seen as families that are not capable of raising their children. So here, then the rest of my presentation will focus more on what we're doing within the ICCRP partnership, looking at concepts and also action where our young people are seen as protagonists. The concept of protagonism, which is very dear to the Latin American region, I will come back to it in a minute, and also the concept of active participation and citizen participation. I'll come back to that in a bit. First, I would like to show you what we have been doing in terms of action. We are combining the analysis and the discussion on the meaning of concepts as also they appear in different cultures, because we are several countries, we have this very rich opportunity to problematize the use of the terminology. They are not innocent, right? And also the ways that they are appropriated in the South. And I bring the concept of protagonism to say the ways that concepts like that have been appropriated in the North. So the case study we have been carrying out within ICCRP currently, because we have years of work, we have been looking at 5 different cities in a particular area of the state of Rio. The idea is to promote the participation and the protagonism of children and young people in the Municipal Rights Council. We have councils in all the municipalities of Brazil, over 5,000, and in other public spaces in 5 cities in the state of Rio. And we have a special focus on understanding intergenerational relations. How can we better work together, young people, children, young children, teenagers, youth, senior citizens. This photo here, Gustavo is one of our young researchers. We were in the capital of Brazil, in Brasília. George was there. We met here again. And I won't have time to tell you, but it's I don't know if George agrees with me, but I think it's what gives us so much hope. We were in the capital of Brazil, something we say the conference is really a huge assembly with 3,000 people. We had 700 delegates, and half of them basically were young people, teenagers up to 18, together in the same space. And the work in each municipality starts at least a year before, where they start discussing children's rights, what will be the recommendations, what we need to change, children and adults together. Then they elect the delegates, the young ones that will come, that will be elected. Then in the state, each state of Brazil, 26 of them, the same process takes place. And then the delegates are elected to come to Brasilia to vote, deliberate on policies with the adults. Okay, let's not romanticize it. It's not all beautiful. It's very complex. The adult-centric perspectives, positions, attitudes of adults. And also, I have been talking so much with the young people in our team, the prejudice young people also have against adults. It's tension, but there's no democracy without tension. So for me, it gives me a lot of hope. And the moment we have extreme right administration in the country, this is not allowed to happen. They take the time to stop any possibility of collective action that might bring people to be more aware politically and to confront the ideas, attitudes, and decisions that are taken at the top level there. Sometimes in the middle of the night, nobody knows about it, nobody discusses, and we need young people to be aware of all this. They will be there tomorrow, not us, not me at least. So, just to heading to the end of my presentation, apart from all the work on the ground, the empirical work together with young people in Brazil, in our case, looking at the Children's Rights Councils, we have other projects on activism. I don't have the time to go into them here, but we are looking at different groups of children, not only the children who come from poor families, with the idea that because they are poor, they have to take the burden to then defend their rights and everybody's rights as well. As in contrast to wealthy children that believe, and everybody believes, they have all their rights guaranteed, and also that there are no violation of rights in those settings. I tell you, this looks obvious, but it's not obvious. We just had an experience in a very rich school last week where the 25 young people, 15-year-olds, had never read the statute, had no idea what the Children's Rights Council was. These are the kids that will be our mayors, our even governors. They'll be in all the departments. They had no idea. We had to take them to the council so they would know what it is. And still, the attitude is not for us. That's for the street children, for the poor children, the black children, the indigenous children, whatever. So a lot to change there. And in our work, in the network I have been leading this working group on conceptual interconnections, really looking at all these concepts that are dear, important in our proposal, and also to help us perhaps change the lens through which we understand research and action with children and about children. So when I'm not going to go into all these concepts, but I would like to share with you that we see when we talk about intergenerational, first, when we talk about protagonism, and I will leave my glasses here, just to be more precise, we are talking about active participation, we are talking about a leading role, a protagonic role by young people, where we understand that they have competence and they have autonomy to be participants as any other adult. And adults or others should not speak for them, should not silence them and speak for them. When we talk about citizen participation, we are connecting, and this is very important in the Latin American context. We are talking about participation as a right. We're talking about the connection between participation and citizenship, as being a citizen, as political actors that are part of a collectivity targeting at social change. And finally, the coloniality came as part of a recent movement that I think has been growing internationally to help us become more aware of the process of colonization that happened in our countries, and the term decoloniality would really mean a form or an act of resistance against universalizing narratives that silence multiple voices and sources of knowledge and wisdom. So we're talking about a very active term as well that has to do with an attitude of understanding the processes, but thinking how not only we can deconstruct those processes, but also how we can use this lens to see things in a different way. And that's very useful when we think about research with young people. The methodologies that have been used traditionally, all the knowledge coming from a couple of countries from the north that become the basis for all the reflections. That is what we have been contesting So the colonial perspectives that help challenge the supposedly universal, commonly northern-centric perspectives on childhoods that counters the international development agendas. Here is, just so you know, Tara was part of this initiative where we were able to put together several articles, several colleagues in various parts, various countries discussing colonial perspectives on childhood. That is in our website, and Portuguese, in English, Spanish, not everything yet. Perhaps we should translate everything. And just to conclude, because I like to conclude in a positive note, always, because if we understand history, if we understand really those processes, and we have the chance to reconstruct, to contest, to rethink, we should have hope. The world is not so different than in the past. Human beings have not changed that much, as we can see. So, in many ways, we are in a very privileged moment where people can express themselves in various ways. I tell you, 15 years looking at the history of child welfare in Brazil, there was absolutely nothing written that a mother would say about the disappearance of a child. Nothing, not a word from the children that were taken from the streets to prison institutions or tortured or died or whatever. We didn't know because it was not there, because it was totally dominated by a small group. That was the documentation in history. Now it's not like that. You can take pictures, you can put on the internet, you can, even in countries where there is a lot of repression. So to conclude, I would say that our Constitution, by no chance, called Citizen Constitution of 1988, and the Statute on the Child of the Adolescent of the 90s are crucial references for us Brazilians, and with important guidelines for all of us to fight for. Nothing is perfect, but it is an important base and an important reference for all of us, including young people, and the whole idea that children and youth are protagonists in defense of their own rights. That gives us a lot of hope in terms of a lot that we have to do, but it's already happening. And I just put here one example just because it is so present now, the huge threat in so many of our countries of the destruction of our forests, the pollution of our waters, the oceans, which means a fast destruction of the planet. Children are very sensitive to all this. And if they are given the opportunity, they will be fierce defenders of nature. The problem is that often they do not have the contact. 80% of Brazilians live in cities, huge cities, not very human. A city with 25 million people cannot be a city where you have a lot of green spaces. Even if you go to smaller cities in the Amazon, you could be in a small city without a single tree in the rainforest, in the town, because very greedy business people go there and take all the wood, right? So global warming, climate justice, and the protection of the Brazilian Amazon is one aspect where young people have been demonstrating some presence, and we hope that next year with COP30 happening in the Amazon, in the Brazilian Amazon, we are going to make a lot of noise. Okay? So this is what I prepared for you, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene, for that fantastic talk. And a warm welcome to our recent arrivals to this very full room. We're so happy you're here. Thank you, thank you. This is fabulous. And now I'm going to try somewhat gracefully to come back to our landing slide here and introduce you all. We're moving from Brazil to broadening out our geographic and scope and thinking today around children's rights by having the wonderful George Lima, who is here with us. And he currently serves as the coordinator of the monitoring section 3 of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and the main specialist of the Rapporteur on the Rights of the Child. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and a graduate specialist degree in international human rights law from the University of Buenos Aires School of Law. In Brazil, he served as international advisor and chief of staff of the National Secretariat for the Rights of Children, as well as director of the Brazilian Central Authority and International Legal Cooperation Unit for the Protection of Children. So the floor is yours. George, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome.
I'm going to stand,
Okay.
just because, you know, then you set a very good example. I don't have a presentation, but I think that if I say I'm going to be more nervous than I'm already am. And the reason for that is, as Tara said, I'm from Brazil, so English is not my first language. But many years ago, in 2006, I came here to study English to Toronto. And actually, Marnie McLean, who's here, I'm very happy that she's here, received me in her house while I was here in Canada to study English. So I'm going to put that education to the test, right? And see if I can do this presentation entirely in English. But first of all, I'm going to thank you, Tara, for the invitation to be here. I have been working with children's rights for more than 15 years now. And to be honest, it is not a very, well, it's very rewarding, of course, to work with children's rights. But it's also very challenging because we see, especially when we work with human rights violations, that's where I'm, you know, my background, my main background is. You can see a lot of very ugly things. But then you get to come to a university and talk to amazing people and discuss what we could be doing to change that reality, right? So, and this is basically what I love to do in the job that I do, to go places and be able to share a little bit of my experience in this 15 years that I've been doing this job. And of course, to share the panel with Irene and Robert, it's also an amazing opportunity. Irene has been a professor for a long time, and I aspire to get there someday, so I want to be a teacher at some point. Let's see if that will happen. I said that last week when I was in Mexico for also a presentation in the University of Aguascalientes there. But anyway, so my perspective here is going to be a little bit different from Irene because I'm not going to focus in one particular country. I'm going to talk about the Americas as a region, and I'm also going to focus a little bit on the Inter-American human rights system. So I'm going to talk about the rights in particular, and I'm also going to discuss the challenges that our region is facing a little bit closer to okay, sorry, because of the camera, is that correct? Okay, sorry. And right here too?
Yeah.
Okay. So many cameras. So the reason why I'm going to talk about the region and the challenges is because sometimes we don't, well, we know the challenges that we are facing in our own countries, but we don't realize that we have challenges in other countries as well, and they are facing basically the same problems with different perspectives. But international cooperation could be a very good start to see what we could be doing differently to guarantee the rights of children. So I'm going to try to be very concise in talking about those challenges, but I'm going to try to also bring the main challenges. I'm not going to talk about all of them. But first, let's start understanding the size of the population that we were talking about. I couldn't find an exact number of children in the Americas, but more or less, according to the data that I researched in different websites, there are about 268 million children in our region. So it's a huge population, right? And they are in rural areas, in urban areas. So they are children with disabilities, they are indigenous children. So there are a huge diversity of children in our region, and they all are entitled to rights, just as an adult, right? The thing that we need to, and you already talked about this, to recognize that they are subject of rights, and they need this protection, including a special protection. I'm going to talk about this later on, because they are not full-grown adults, so they need also the society and us to protect their rights. So in the region, in the Americans, we have a history of cooperation. So the first time that we included the rights of children in a document, a regional document, was in 1948, when the countries of the Americas approved the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. And in Article 7, it said that every woman who's pregnant or breastfeeding, as well as every child, has the right to special protection, care, and assistance. Then, in 1969, we approved, signed, and ratified the Convention on the Rights, the American Convention on Human Rights, that in Article 19 establishes that every child has the right to the measures of protection required by his condition as a minor on the part of his family, society, and the state. So here, not only the states were improving on the concept of special protection that was already present in the American Declaration, but also saying that it's not only a responsibility of the family, but also society and the states. So that is it's a huge leap forward if we think about it. And then the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in 2002 published an advisory opinion to say that children are entitled to all the rights that everybody has as a human being, but also that states should be attending to their best interests. And this is a concept that is very important, because the best interest of the child is individual, right? So you need to determine the best interest of that particular child before you make any decisions regarding that particular child. In 2014, the Inter-American Court also published another advisory opinion on children in the context of migration. But the most important part for me, at least, in this advisory opinion, is the recognition there is an international body that we could call the International Rights of Children, right? Or International Children's Rights Law. So that we are not alone in the sense that it's not only one country determining the rights of children or protecting them, but the whole international community. Then we move to the situation in the Americas. So I'm going to talk about different challenges that the ICCR has been observing. But first, before I talk about the challenges, I would like to ask here, how many of you know the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and knows what we do? Thank you for being honest. So, The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is a intergovernmental organization that was created in 65 years ago. In September, we are 65 years. So it was created together with the Organization of American States. So the OAS was created by the OAS Charter, and in the Charter, it established that there was going to be an Inter-American Human Rights Commission, which mandate was to promote human rights and also to provide the states with recommendations on what they should be doing to protect human rights. So part of the work that we do is to monitor, to follow what states are doing and how the human rights situation is, so that the commission, the body of 7 independent specialists that meet regularly in Washington, D.C., that's where we are based, they can issue recommendations for states through reports and resolutions, right, in different ways, so that states can actually implement them. And the Commission is also responsible for analyzing individual petitions that can, at some point, reach the Inter-American Court. So if any of you experience a human rights violation, you can go through the legal system here in Canada, and then if you don't get the remedies that you're looking for, and you consider that you should take your case to the Inter-American Commission, then you can take your case to the Commission. And because Canada didn't recognize the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court, we could not take the case to the court. But in many countries in the region, the Commission can take the case to the court, right? And then the ruling from the court is binding, not only for that particular country, but all the countries that recognize the jurisdiction, because they signed a commitment to comply with all the rulings, not only the ones that applies to them as a party to the lawsuit. But this is just a basic introduction to explain the work that we do and why we identify the challenges that I'm going to talk about now. So one of the big challenges in the region right now is the recruitment of children by organized crime. So we've seen this in many countries. It's not specific to Brazil, for example. You have, and I feel very comfortable talking about Brazil because that's my own country, and I have my freedom of speech to talk about it. But as you understand, we do face a lot of problems regarding that. Recent data showed that only in Colombia, in 2023, there was 184 cases of recruitment of children by organized crime, against 30 cases in 2022. So that is a 500% more or less increase in the number of cases. But we're talking about one specific country. If you consider Central America, for example, where you do have a very big challenge about organized crime, you will see that the problem is even worse. And then in countries where you have a situation of conflict, for example in Haiti, then we cannot even imagine how they are using children there, because there is no specific data about the situation in that particular country. But then, of course, the ICCR is shedding light on this problem. We published a report last year to discuss the particular problem of recruitment of children and organized crime, and the impact of organized crime on children's rights in Central America, in the north of Central America. And in every report that we publish, and you can read them in our website, all available in English, you will see that this is a huge problem in the region. And that connects to the following challenge, that is the juvenile justice system, right? So when you have a child meaning a person that is under 18, right? When you have a child that commits a crime in our region, you should apply a particular type of protection system that will be of responsibility. Of course, it's not that doesn't mean that the child is not going to face responsibility to the act that was formed, but there are some principles that you need to follow because that child is in a period of their time, of their life, that you can still implement measures to make sure that that period of responsibility is also educational, right? So that child can learn and reintegrate to society, if it's a case of the deprivation of liberty, in a better way than before, right? So that's the idea, of course. But then the challenges that we see is that in our region, basically in all 35 countries, you see situations where they go in an institution that are actually prisons and not a place where they should learn responsibility, right? They face torture, they face violence, they face degradation, abuse. Sometimes the conditions of these institutions are so horrifying. And I can tell you by first-hand experience, I've been to many of these institutions in the 6 years that I've been working for the Commission. You wouldn't want any child to live in a place like that. So why we are doing that? As states, I sincerely don't know. There is a lot of stigma against children who commit crime, especially in our country. Then she will be able to confirm what I'm saying here. Every time that an adolescent, a teenager, commits a crime, then it gets all over the news, right? Mm-hmm. Even though the percentage of crimes committed by teenagers is a very small percentage compared to other crimes in our countries. But of course, this is what we are trying to recommend to states to say, I mean, you have to change the way that you're doing this, otherwise the problem is going to be in a cycle, right? And then we get to sexual violence and violence in general. Unfortunately, and it hardens my heart to say this, sexual violence is one of the most common violation of children's rights in our region. And you know what? It is happening inside their own homes. By someone who's very close to them. A parent, an uncle, a teacher, right? So what we are trying to do now is to reinforce the responsibility of states, that it's not because something is happening in a private home that the state is not responsible to guarantee that child's rights. And then, of course, how do you do that without interfering in the integrity of the family, because they also have a right to privacy, right? But when you balance those two rights, what comes first? And I think that you all agree that you need to protect the child. You all agree, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Just to see if you are awake. But you know, but then you have, of course, to overcome a lot of challenges. For example, how does a child reports a sexual violation, right? So we is still facing a lot of challenges in this particular area. And not only sexual violence, but then we come to the right to live in a family. Almost 200,000 children in our region are being raised in residential institutions without a parent, without someone that they can use as reference of learning. Sometimes in big orphanages, in some countries in small institutions. Some countries use foster care, and in some countries it's good to see that they have a very strong foster care program. But in general, and I'm talking in general, the 35 countries in our region, children are being raised in residential institutions. That means a clear violation of their right to be raised by a family. They're missing a lot in terms of community, right? They also face torture in some places, abuse, sexual violence inside the institutions. The conditions sometimes are deplorable as well. And of course, that we've been facing the challenge of time. Sometimes you need to send the children to an institution because that is the immediate solution for a problem, right? Or a temporary solution for a problem. But that is how we should see it. It is a temporary solution. A child should not be for a long period of time, and I'm not going to even risk saying what time that should be, because remember, there is the principle of the best interest of the child. You have to consider it. It could be 3 months. It could be 6 months. But a year is definitely not a period that a child should remain in an institution. Imagine that in some countries in the region, I'm not going to name any of them, but there are children who actually get to 18 years in an institution, right? So they are growing up in institutions. And that's why the ICCR published a report in 2013 that remains very current to this day, where we talk about the importance of children being raised within a family and measures that states should be implementing so that the residential institution solution is actually temporary, and then you move to a more permanent solution. Meaning, in particular, returning the child to their family of origin, that is the main goal. And if you need to implement social programs to prepare that family to receive the child back, that's what you should do. But then, if returning to the family of origin is not a solution that is connected to the child's best interest, then you need to make that determination in an expedited manner, but carefully, of course. You don't want to rush to make that determination. So you see the challenge there? You need to do it quickly, but you cannot do it without being thorough about it. And then moving to a more permanent solution that could be, for example, an extended member of the family or adoption, right? But we should not close the door for adoption, because adoption is a way, is an opportunity for children to be raised in a family. And then I get to the participation of children. That is also something that Irene mentioned. But I think that right now, after many years of working with children's rights, we can see it clearly of how children should be participating, not only individually, talking about their own situation. So if we are talking about custody, the child should be participating in the decision making, right? But also collectively, and this is where Irene focused in particular in Brazil, so the way that they participate in creating public policy. But there are many challenges in that regard, and one was also mentioned by Irene. We adults, we tend to look at children and see them as an object that should be protected, right? And not as a person that has their own opinions, and they want to share that opinion, even if they are very small and little, right? We know that whoever has children here, you know that a 5-year-old can be more opinionated than anybody else, right? And when they get to 12, they know exactly what they want. They are going to get what they want. That is a different issue, because there is a principle of progressive autonomy, right? That is also enshrined in the convention. But then, of course, that as adults, we need to listen to them and consider their opinions in our process of making a decision. So much so that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights actually, in a very recent ruling regarding a case against Paraguay, actually called the attention. You know, when I do this, you understand the gesture, yes? So I'm not going to say it because I'm being recorded, but the Inter-American Court actually did this to the Commission and said, you know what, this is a teenager. The case is about a teenager. why didn't you listen to the teenager's opinion on the case? And I'm being really honest with you here, because we have to look to ourselves as well. We should be doing more. And that's why in December of last year, the Commission published a resolution on the participation of children in our mechanisms. We've been recommending states to improve participation, that we need to do more internally as well. But just to mention a couple principles in this resolution is that this participation should be safe for children. So one of the main points is that we prepare a safety assessment before the participation of a child in any of our mechanisms. For example, we are going to have a hearing on corporal punishment, right? In the Caribbean region. And we are going to include testimony from people who are now adults but suffered corporal punishment when children. But we also want, if possible, to have children telling their stories regarding corporal punishment. Maybe not as victims, because that could be difficult to do, considering that normally the parents are the ones inflicting corporal punishment, but maybe it's their point of view of what they think about corporal punishment, because they have a voice about that. But how we do that, we need to do an assessment first. It's a very thorough assessment to see if we're not going to be putting those children who are going to participate in the hearing at risk, right? And finally, another challenge that we are still, we are seeing more and more recently, and this is terrible, is a movement of regressive measures on the rights of children. So I talked about sexual violence. I talked about corporal punishment. I talked about custody, right? Can you believe, and I'm asking sincerely, that there are actually movements in different countries right now. They are trying to return to a situation where those rights were not guaranteed in the level that they are today. So there are movements, for example, to reinstate corporal punishment in some countries. There are movements right now that are trying to prevent children from getting sexual education. That is a very strong tool to protect them against sexual violence. And the Commission is very aware of the situation, and we are trying to understand the dynamics of this movement to try to shed light to what is been going on, so that states can prevent regressive measures. And this is also in international human rights principles. Once you get to a point, you cannot go back. So when you get to a point where you're protecting someone's rights in this level here, you cannot go back to a smaller, lesser protection of that right, right? But just to finalize here, just to mention that there's also a movement saying that, remember the principle that I said that was enshrined in the American Convention on Human Rights in 1969, talking about the protection of society, the family, society, and state. So there are movements now that are saying, you know what, no, the family should be the sole protector of the child's rights. The state should not be concerned. This is my private affairs. I mean, does this make sense to you? I mean, for me, it doesn't, right? Because science shows us that most violations are happening inside the home. So if that is the case, how is it possible that we're going to, do this and let everything happen inside a home? So, as I said, the Commission is looking at this very concerning movement. And lastly, I just want to mention that another priority that we have is the national protection of children, the system, because all of that is important, but it can only be addressed, all of those challenges, there are many more, but I've only focused on the ones that I consider more pressing, we can only address them if states create and implement national protection systems with different actors working together. Social services, health services, educational services, legal services. So everybody should be working together to achieve the main goal, that is protecting the right of every child in our region. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you ever so much, George, for your expansive overview of a range of important issues facing children, youth, and their human rights in the Americas. And now we are going to our third and final presentation of our exciting panel. And I have the honor and privilege of introducing you all to the wonderful, honorable Professor Robert Nanima. And he is a member of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. He is the Special Rapporteur on Children Affected by Armed Conflict and Chairperson of the Working Group on the Implementation of Decisions. He is also an Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Criminal Justice and Procedure in the Dulles Omar Institute, I mixed that up, Department of Criminal Justice and Procedure in the Faculty of Law at the University of Western Cape in South Africa, and he is also a research fellow at the Dulles Omar Institute of Constitutional Law, Human Rights and Governance at the same university. He lectures in undergraduate modules of child justice and law of evidence, and he lectures postgraduate courses of international anti-corruption law and anti-corruption law in South African context, and continues to supervise undergraduate, master's, and doctoral students. And he has published and presented at various national and international conferences. And it is such a delight to have you here in person, Robert. And I am so pleased that you're here with us all. And a warm welcome to your part of the panel. Would you like me to look after your slides for you from here, and you could stay there, or do you want to get up? What would you like?
I think I'll come back.
Perfect. Okay. So here's the
Very good morning. I would like to say thank you, Tara, for ensuring that we make it to this room. It's like I've known Tara for the last 10 years, yet I only got to meet her in person yesterday. And she had the pleasure of taking me around Toronto. So I think I know much about your university now. And it's also a great honor to meet Irene, finally, because of Tara. We have been meeting online for various meetings since the pandemic. So it's also good to attach a face.
Yes.
It's good to meet Sachi. Yes, I think we had an engagement online. It's good to meet Steve and very many other people.
Yes.
So it's a good honor for me to be here, and once again, thanks for the opportunity. So I'm going to take you across the cold Atlantic because I think the shores that we have of the Atlantic in South Africa, it's quite cold water. We simply enjoy the beaches, but we cannot swim there until we cross to the Indian Ocean, where there's the Benguela Current, the side of Durban, and then we can enjoy the waters there. So it's going to be, much as it's a cold trip that day, I hope that I'll keep you awake as we have this conversation. So I was asked to speak about child rights in Africa, and my perspective was, perhaps I'll not speak about it generally. Let me look at specific aspects. How do we do monitoring? How do we ensure accountability? How do we ensure implementation? And it's interesting that that's what my colleague has done within Americas. But I think one common denominator that I can pick from the conversations we have had is the issue of decoloniality, the issue of decolonization, the issue of various countries, various regions trying to find specific solutions to the problems of children in their midst. Because usually, if we're answering children questions, we should not answer the child question. It should be the American child question, the South American child question, the Brazilian child question, the African child question. In putting that specificity to the child and putting that child in the center, it will inform the imperative initiatives that you come up with that speak to that specific child other than having very general engagements. So in terms of my presentation, I'll briefly speak about the African Children's Charter. I'll take the cue from George, who decided to ask you, and it was established that very few people knew about the inter-American system. I'll assume that you don't know much about the African Children's Charter. You'll excuse me for taking that assumption, but I believe it's on that basis that we shall also appreciate the African Children's Committee, what we do from that perspective. Then how do we monitor, how do we do accountability, how do we do aspects of implementation, and I'll latch in on a specific initiative that we use. That's Agenda 2040. That is a 25-year initiative that was developed by the African Committee of Experts in terms of improving the place of the child in Africa. And I would also want to say that our understanding of the African Children's Charter should be from the perspective that it was informed by decolonization. In other words, how do we have specific initiatives that speak to our plight as the African people? So, if we are looking at the African Children's Charter, two questions have to be asked. One, why was it adopted? It was adopted at the time that we had just had a Convention on the Rights of the Child that had been passed out. And secondly, what is this added value that we get from the African Children's Charter that makes it very distinct, that makes it speak to the African child's problem? So in terms of why it was adopted, there are specific aspects that the Convention on the Rights of the Child did not deal with. One, it did not deal with the situation of children in apartheid. In South Africa, they call it apartheid. So because it did not deal with that, that was a specific gap that was not dealt with. Secondly, it did not deal with specific factors that were affecting the female child in Africa. Child marriages, harmful traditional practices, female genital mutilation. Those aspects do not appear in the Convention. But that's the lived reality of the African female child. Thirdly, much as the Convention on the Rights of the Child spoke to aspects of the duties of the child, it did not contextualize the role of the extended family of the child in Africa. Remember, the African Children's Charter looks at the child in terms of about 6 specific spaces. One, the family. Second, the community. The place of locality where the child is, the national level, the continental level, and the international level. And it calls on child participation of this child right from the family across to the international level. The Convention on the Rights of the Child does not have all those distinct spaces. It simply states that states should ensure that there is participation of the child. But that does not mean that it hasn't done much in terms of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. It has done a lot, and actually aspects of participation of the child. We borrow a lot from the jurisdiction of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. One other aspect that the Committee on the Rights of the Child did not deal with was the minimum age of military service. From the country that I come from, we used to have young soldiers whom we used to call the Kadogos, who fought the Revolutionary War. Children as young as 16 having AK-47. Sorry, not 16, 13. 11, 12, 13. And when this specific government came into power, they were recognized in society as having liberated the country, but they were not 18. So that's just one specific aspect. If you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it speaks to the child as a person who is below 18 or an age to which the national laws ascribe to. So if the child is 16, that means we shall not take the straight 18 definition. We shall take the 16-year definition. In terms of the lived realities of the child in Africa, if this child who is 16 does not benefit from what all children up to 18 should be benefiting from, in terms of policy development, in terms of participation, in terms of right life and survival and development, then there is something that these specific children between 16 and 18 are missing. I've spoken about responsibilities and duties across the 6 platforms. And I've also spoken about some of the harmful practices as part of the lived realities of the child. So that is why we have the African Children's Charter being adopted. Yes, it was adopted, but what's the added value that it brings on board? One, the definition of the child. The child has been defined under the Charter as a person below the age of 18. No question marks, no commas, but a full stop. Secondly, we don't have the concept of child soldiers, because we feel if we have the concept of child soldiers, we are normalizing this terminology to children. You'll have child soldiers, you'll have child marriage, you'll have child labor, soon it will be child something. So we took a conscious decision not to have child soldiers. Rather, we have children affected by armed conflict. That armed conflict can be in situations of actual armed conflict, situations of strife, or situations of tension. So if there has been elections in a specific country and these children are not going to school because of the revolts or the protests that are going on, that child should be accorded the same treatment, the same protection like a child in situations of conflict, because he's not going to school, he's not able to get treatment, he's not able to use the infrastructure in the community because of the specific conflict. If it's gang-related, let's say in Cape Town, still that child is not going to school because of the bullets that are flying across the streets. If it is a fire that has broken out somewhere in the Western Cape in Naisna, that child is not going to school. So the protection is wide, to the end that it's not about the fact that there is actual armed conflict where this child who is affected is expected to be. But even when this child leaves the space of armed conflict, other spaces which are spaces of solace, maybe the child comes to Canada. The fact that this child is coming from a place of armed conflict, what is Canada doing to ensure that this child is protected in terms of policy, in terms of perhaps the language that this child is using for instruction? We have children who left Somalia and came to Kenya, but they could not be taught in English because they did not understand English. They could only understand Somali. So they had to get specific teachers to teach them Somali in the camps that they were in, despite the fact that there was no actual armed conflict in those specific spaces where they were. The African Children's Charter joins both civil and political rights and socio-economic rights. Perhaps I should say it does not distinguish. It simply says all rights that are provided for in the Charter, the state is expected to exercise all necessary measures to ensure the enjoyment of those rights for the child. So we don't have progressive realization. Of course, someone might say, but aren't you shooting yourself in the foot? There has to be some kind of progressive realization. We have come to learn that when you ask a government for 100%, it will give you 40%. When you ask for 150%, it might give you 80%. So we decide not to distinguish the rights and ask for the 150%. If we get the 40%, we can always review to see to what end shall we get to the 70%. Just like the inter-American system, we use the child rights approach. We use the child's best interest. We use participation, right to life survival and development, and the principle of non-discrimination. The protection of the refugee child under the African Children's Charter is expansive. It does not only speak to the refugee child, but even a child who has been internally displaced. So even if the child has not crossed the border to benefit from the threshold under international refugee law, provided that child has been displaced, the child benefits from all the protection that a child who is a refugee or internally displaced or asylum seeker benefits from. I've spoken about the duties of the child. It's along 6 specific spaces in spectrum, from the family to the community, to the local area, to the national level, to the regional level or continental level, and to the international level. So that's the Charter. The Charter has a committee, or the African Committee on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, that is mandated to monitor its implementation. So it monitors promotion and protection of the rights of the child. It does not literally monitor prevention. But does that mean we don't monitor prevention? So we read prevention into our promotional initiatives and we read prevention into our protectional initiatives. So if we are promoting the need for the Charter to be ratified, we also speak to states about what will be done to prevent. If we are protecting, if we are speaking to protection of the child, we also speak aspects that should be taken to prevent actual violations. So we monitor the promotion and protection, and we also have an interpretative role where we issue general comments. For instance, we have the general comment on Article 22 in terms of the rights of children affected by armed conflict. We have the general comment on Article 27 in terms of sexual exploitation of children, general comments on Article 1 that speaks about obligations of states in terms of the specific obligations under the Charter. But despite all this rosy picture, there are always challenges. I think the first challenge is that states never give you their 100%. They give you 40 or 30 or 25 or 10% or 5%. It remains a challenge. The other challenge is that implementation of decisions remains a problem. And we have discovered that it's not only an African problem. It's a global problem. I was surprised to learn that out of the 60,000 plus decisions of the European Court of Fundamental Rights, of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, 50% of those decisions have not been implemented. At the African Commission, which is the first organization that sits in Banjul on human and people's rights, out of the 600 decisions, it has concluded 300, over 150 decisions. I was reading something about the Inter-Americas, it is the same issue. Something about our own committee, it's the same issue. So until we have actual implementation that sees that child benefit from the various initiatives that we engage in, I think that remains a big challenge. So this table is a list of the composition of the current members. Believe me, I might not be able to capture the names now. But from a structural perspective, Africa has 5 regions. So from every region, there are 2 members. Disaggregated on account of gender and on account of the region. So there is a male and a female from each region. However, the drafters noticed that if we have 2 from each region, we would have 10 members. When it comes to voting, they would always be retired at some point. So they created a floating seat. So in addition to the 10, there is a floating seat that changes either every 5 years or 10 years. That's very important. The tenure of the members of the committee is 5 years, subject to a renewal if you're re-elected by the heads of states for another 5 years. So in the event that you're not re-elected and you're on the floating seat, it will move to another region. If you are re-elected, you retain the floating seat for another 5 years because any member is eligible to be on the committee for 10 years. So that is the reasoning behind the floating seat. But of course, usually it does not happen. It does not mean that you will not have ties. There are instances where you might have an election, but not all the members turn up for the election. Maybe 10 members turn up, and there's still a tie. And when there is that tie, the chairperson is expected to give the casting vote. But consider a scenario where the chairperson is also running for the same seat, and there is a tie. So, does this cease being a chairperson? Does this cease being a contestant to become a chairperson, to give himself the casting vote, and become a contestant, to be proclaimed to be chairperson? That's a conversation to keep us awake. So in terms of monitoring is essentially based on the working methods of the committee. That is getting state party reports and issuing concluding observations. Secondly, having missions. These missions could be fact-finding missions, they could be investigative missions, they could be advocacy missions, they could be follow-up missions on communications. We also have a communications procedure, and I think this is one other added value. We have a communications procedure that is inbuilt within the African Children's Charter. There is no need for state parties to sign an optional protocol to ascribe to the communications procedure. We also carry out research. We have done a lot of research on various aspects. I'll not go into that now. We also use commemorations. For instance, we have the Day of the African Child every 16th of June, where we remind states about their obligations, and this commemoration takes place in a specific country on an annual basis. But we believe while that committee is mandated to monitor the promotion and protection of the child in the 55 states, it cannot do so on its own. So there are other like-minded entities such as civil society organizations, international organizations, the state parties themselves that work on the monitoring to ensure that it sees the light of day. So while it's a preserve of the committee, it's also not a preserve of the committee. If you look at it from both a vertical and horizontal axis, the same thing could be reflected in accountability. While the states are expected to be accountable, we also call on civil society organizations to exercise some kind of introspection, to have their own accountability before they call on the state to be accountable. We call on the committee members to also exercise some kind of accountability on their own part before they call on the states to be accountable. So it's something that is very fluid. But one aspect of accountability is that it's about calling for responsibility, calling for answers, answerability, and above all, calling for states to enforce, to ensure that there is implementation of specific decisions. A very good question, what about non-state actors that have not ratified? Where is the degree of accountability? We usually use international law, where you are occupying the position of a state and you're collecting taxes. You're doing what a state should be doing, then you should be accountable. If you remember, there was a story of a guy called Mahdi in Mali who was in charge of this specific area and was collecting taxes and was doing all sorts of things, including destruction of property. When he was taken to the ICC, interestingly, he pleaded guilty and was held to be responsible. A certain scholar said that he had gone to the cafeteria to take a cup of tea, knowing that the Mahdi case would take about 10 years. It took 30 minutes. Because he pleaded guilty. So for him, he saw a chance in developing jurisprudence fall to the floor because someone pleaded guilty. From my perspective, there was some kind of responsibility in terms of that specific non-armed state actor. I'll go to implementation. Implementation is informed by the various positions in the Charter. I like Article 1 because it requires the state to take all necessary measures. It places a specific degree of urgency on the child to enjoy rights. This is a radical departure from the CRC. The CRC states in most of its provisions, every state party, the state party shall. The Charter, the African Children's Charter says every child shall. So there's an urgency on the child, notwithstanding the fact that there is that mandatory obligation on the state. I've spoken about added value, the child rights-based approach. All those, once you use them together, they should be able to help the implementation of decisions. Agenda 2040, it's a 25-year program that has 10 aspirations. Those aspirations are tagged to specific rapporteurs. The 11 members of the committee are not only country rapporteurs, where every member is in charge of 5 countries, but they are also thematic rapporteurs. For instance, armed conflict, education, health. So they deal with both the country aspects and the thematic aspects. So we use the thematic aspects of the various rapporteurs to speak to aspirations under Agenda 2040. Unfortunately, I'll go into the detail. I'll not go into those details, but I hope that this slide will be shared, and I'd love to take your questions. Thank you very much.
How wonderful to learn from you, Robert and George and Irene. Thank you so much for those wonderful contributions. And also the fact that you really kept the time limit, so we have time to talk, which is really great. So a big thank you to all of you for all your contributions there. And you know, I was so excited at the beginning of this event, I totally forgot to introduce myself. So, so apologies, because there's some of you I haven't met before here today. And so my name is Tara Collins. I'm a professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at Toronto Metropolitan University, where we are all gathering here today. And I am here to be your MC. And so now we have the fantastic opportunity of inviting you all to participate and engage with our very distinguished and learned guests.
Welcome to the International and Canadian Child Rights Partnership. Delighted to have the wonderful Holly Doel-Mackaway with us today to share an understanding and her perspective and wisdom about children's rights in Australia. And to give you a bit of background about the fabulous Holly, she has been working in the children's rights field for over 25 years as a lawyer, a social worker, and academic. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on international children's rights law, children's participation and protection rights, juvenile justice, girls' rights, and Indigenous children's rights. She is currently working on several major grants spanning 5 continents, and she is the co-executive and editor-in-chief of the Australian Journal of Human Rights and co-leads the Children's Rights Participation and Protection research stream in the Faculty of Arts and is an elected member of the Academic Senate. She collaborates with a range of human rights non-governmental organizations and regularly comments on child law matters in the media. And she also plays an active role within the legal profession in the Asia Pacific region in her role as an expert counselor for children, Indigenous people, and gender for the Law Asia Human Rights Committee. She teaches constitutional law, child and elder law, and legal research methodologies. So the floor is yours, Holly, and I'm just going to bring up your PowerPoint and start from the beginning. Make sure that we see you. So I think we should be fine there.
Wonderful.
Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tara, for that very generous introduction. And it's such an honor to be presenting with Irene and Robert today. And I recognize our different experiences of children's rights around the globe. And I present I guess I would like it to be a conversation, and the information that I share today is only from a perspective that is mine, that others will have many different perspectives. So please be aware that I share this through a human rights lens and a lens that is shaped by a career in children's rights. So I'm Holly Doel-Mackaway and I work at the Macquarie Law School, and I have a background in law and social work. So I did a lot of clinical work with children who had experienced abuse and neglect for the first portion of my career. And as a result of having that contact with children and young people, I wondered about remedies, and I wondered about, well, I'm seeing so many children on a daily basis who have experienced abuse. What can I do in my lifetime to assist with children, of which there are so very many across all places across the globe? And I thought, well, what if I become a lawyer and I forget about criminal law, because it's pretty redundant with regards to prosecutions of crimes against children. After being a social worker for around 7 years and taking children and women through the criminal justice system, I learned that only a very small proportion of those who experience abuse ever attain justice, whatever that might mean, through the legal system. So I wondered about civil remedies, and I wondered about perhaps becoming a lawyer who ran civil claims and got remedies for children and women, financial remedies for harms suffered. I didn't end up doing that. I ended up working for UNICEF, and I became extremely in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And since then, I have become very well versed in the convention, particularly Article 12 of that convention. And that's my main area of interest. But before I continue on, I'd really like to acknowledge that that I am on stolen land, as Tara has already acknowledged. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I live on stolen land as well in Australia, and that I live and work on Darug land belonging to the Doel-Mackaway peoples, and that Doel-Mackaway peoples have been nurturing and raising up strong children since the beginning. And those child rearing practices are not acknowledged in colonial systems. And part of what I want to do today in this presentation is acknowledge those child rearing practices that so in need of more knowledge and more acknowledgement. And certainly the time that I have spent as a researcher in Aboriginal communities has demonstrated the power of Indigenous communities around child rearing, something that is very much obfuscated in the colonial systems within which I work. All right, I think a good place to start is, just going to try and move this on.
Why?
Oh no, this is the correct one, but I don't think that I'll be able to move on the.
Oh dear. Oh, sorry, I'm not pressing. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe. Oh dear. 1 second. Yeah, you just press here.
Press there?
Press
Okay.
there. Yes.
Okay, and then go back this way. Great. Oh, I think I'm just going forward. Yeah, let's just go back.
The last time that the Committee on the Rights of the Child considered Australia's implementation and progress towards realisation of children's rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child was in 2019. And the committee members, some of which
happen. I have never seen this happen. So sorry.
All right, so a good starting point for this presentation is to think about young people across the world who are influencing law and policy change. And on the slide, you'll see that there are just a few examples of this. You'll notice Alton Pelcher and her role as water commissioner, I believe. And when she was so very young, she spoke at various UN settings and spoke about the sacredness of water and the right to clean water. We know a lot about Greta Thunberg and her climate advocacy. And what we don't know a lot about, however, is examples such as Indigenous children in Australia. And one that I'd like to bring to the fore is Duan Hussein's advocacy at the UN Human Rights Council in 2019, where he said at that forum, where he was advocating for Indigenous children's rights in the criminal justice system. And at that forum, he said these words: "I want adults to stop putting 10-year-old children in jail. I want my school to be run by Aboriginal people. I want my future to be able to learn strong culture and language. It is about our dreams, our hopes, and our rights." Really powerful words from a very young Indigenous person at the time. He's gone on to do wonderful things. He is the star of a wonderful production called In My Blood It Runs. And even on the plane here from Australia to Canada, I saw that they were playing that documentary. So I really encourage you to have a look at that. It's available freely on YouTube. Another example is the advocacy by Anjali Sharma in 2021, and she successfully argued with her guardian ad litem for the environmental minister to have a duty of care to future generations around climate. So she was arguing around climate justice, and that was successful for a moment. Shortly after that, on appeal, that decision that the federal minister for the environment has a duty of care to young people was overturned on the basis that that matter is non-justiciable, i.e. it is not up to a court to make that decision. Instead, it's up to parliamentarians to write law about that. So what she's done since, and what is before the Australian Senate as I speak, is the Duty of Care Bill. And her and a senator, Senator Pocock, have put forward this Duty of Care Bill, and that is being considered as I speak. So what I'd like to do in this talk is not so much overview the broad body of rights in Australia for children. What I'd like to do instead is focus on what I'm good at. And what I'm good at is understanding the context for Indigenous children in Australia. And the reason I'm doing that is because Noongar scholar Hannah McGlade says that this is the greatest challenge facing Australia now. And I think that we need to take our lead as a non-Indigenous scholar working around Indigenous related matters. We need to take our lead from Indigenous scholars who are saying what is most important. So that's what I'm doing. I'm taking her lead, and I'm not presenting today on the broad children's rights context in Australia, because what I think is most important is that children who are Indigenous in Australia, 3% of the population of our 27 million people in Australia are Indigenous, and a large proportion of that 3% are Indigenous youth. I think that the context for children's rights in Australia is emblematic of the experience of Indigenous children's youth in Australia. So when I speak to Indigenous children's youth experiences around children's rights, I think that is symptomatic and emblematic of the child rights context in Australia. So what is the child rights context? Really briefly. Australia ratified the convention, like most other nations on earth, in 1990. Most other nations ratified around that period of time. We then were fast to ratify the 2 optional protocols. We have indicated that we won't be ratifying the 3rd optional protocol on the communications mechanism, which has huge implications, particularly for Indigenous children, because they don't then have the right to make a complaint of rights breaches to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. So we're very much hoping, and there's strong advocacy for Australia to ratify the 3rd optional protocol. So the context for Indigenous children in Australia. Laura Lundy suggests that it is a cold climate for children's rights globally, and Laura Lundy is a very well-known children's rights scholar and advocate. In my book of 2022, I argue that the context for Indigenous children in Australia is bitterly cold. I describe the context for Indigenous children in Australia as an absence of rights. Now, this conclusion sounds very stark. It is. The stark reality for Indigenous children in Australia is that there is an absence of rights. And this is shown by many different examples of the violation of children and young people's rights in Australia, notably through the child protection system, which includes over-policing of Indigenous children, hyper-policing, a lot of people refer to, and the child protection system and the juvenile justice system work in collaboration to essentially steal children from country and from Aboriginal families at rates far higher than we have ever seen before since invasion of Australia. Now, this is of concern because we ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child some 34 years ago, but in fact, the rights climate for Indigenous children has diminished since our ratification, since our promises that we are going to progressively realise children's rights. It's actually got worse in Australia for Indigenous children. There is some progress in relation to children more broadly, but for Indigenous children, the Australian government and successive governments are removing children into the juvenile justice system and into the child protection system at unprecedented rates. Now, that is of concern for a nation quite small in comparison to other nations, and a nation that is quite wealthy in comparison to many other nations, that we're not managing, we are not addressing from a child rights perspective the rights of Indigenous children and young people. We are seeing reports of egregious abuses of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care and egregious abuses of Aboriginal children within juvenile detention. Indeed, a lot of my research focuses on the fact that there is torture of young people in juvenile detention, and I've written a fair bit about young people's experiences within juvenile detention and within out-of-home care, and an article that is shortly to be published actually quotes in the title, "I thought I was going to die." A young man by the name of Dylan Voller shared that he thought he was going to die in juvenile detention when he was placed in a restraint chair. Very distressing content, and quite symptomatic of broad-ranging abuses of Aboriginal children in detention. And I say of Aboriginal children in detention because the chances of an Aboriginal young person going to detention, particularly if they are a male, are very, very high. At some points in the Northern Territory of Australia, the whole population of juvenile detention is Aboriginal. So you've got to question, what is going on? What is happening that we are incarcerating young Aboriginal people at unprecedented rates? What I want to share with you now is the legal context for Australia in terms of children's rights. We don't have a federal charter of rights. We're the only Western nation that doesn't have a federal charter of rights. There's been so many efforts made to embed a charter of rights within our legal landscape. They have failed. At the moment, we have the Australian Human Rights Commission, who have put forward a proposal for a Human Rights Act. It's an excellent proposal. It includes the rights of children within that proposal, which is very positive. But we don't have a National Children's Act. Now, I've worked in other nations and contributed to the drafting, for example, of the National Children's Act in Solomon Islands. That was 10 years ago. That's recently been brought into force. In Australia, a place where there are so many more resources than, for example, in the Pacific, and yet we still don't have a National Children's Act. What's going on? You've got to question the legal landscape in terms of children's rights in Australia. We also have no treaty with First Peoples in Australia, which is also in the context of our neighbours extremely unusual. And this has significant implications for Aboriginal children. If we had a treaty, we would probably be more likely to have greater and more robust legal protections for Aboriginal children and young people. That might then see reduced rates of Indigenous incarceration. It might then see reduced rates of removal from home and country. I'm not saying law is the answer necessarily. I think political will is also a huge problem, as well as pervading apathy around the rights status of Indigenous children and Indigenous peoples more broadly in Australia. Some of those barriers are very, very difficult to overcome. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has stressed time and time again through our periodic reporting cycle that Australia needs to implement a Children's Rights Act nationally. We're a federal system, and to have national legislation is really important. Our constitution, however, is a barrier to equality within our nation. It's our apex legislation, still inherited from the UK, and it's problematic because it embeds racism within the text of it. And this is very difficult when you've got a piece of guiding legislation, our constitution, that has sections within it, i.e. in the heads of power of our constitution, section 51 and subsection 26 of that is known as the race power. The race power is a power that empowers federal parliament to make special laws for the people of any race. I know I can see confusion around the room. Why would we have in a modern country a power that is focused around race? It is irrelevant today. However, it has been applied in many circumstances to the disadvantage of Indigenous peoples. For example, a well-known case, the Carleton University case, the race power was used to build a bridge across a particular stretch of water. And that bridge was built upon sacred women's business lands. And the race power was used as a justification to build that bridge. It is a significant breach of Aboriginal people's rights to have the race power. It's not we call it dead letter of the law. It's not a dead letter. Unlike another offensive provision in the Constitution, which is Section 25, which enables the states to ban people of any race from voting in an election. That hasn't been used, thankfully. However, the racist power has been used and does get used, and that is highly problematic. We had a referendum in 1967, and that referendum got rid of any reference to Indigenous peoples from our Constitution because those references were negative. Now we just have no reference to Indigenous peoples at all. And that is a huge legal problem within the legal landscape of our nation. And what that then does is it silences, it obfuscates Indigenous peoples within our social structure. Indeed, we had a referendum last year, and it was a landslide failure. It was a referendum to have a voice recognised, Indigenous voice recognised in our constitution. It was an arm's length voice, much like a Human Rights Commission or another statutory body. It was arm's length. It didn't have the power, the voice power, didn't have the power to veto, didn't have the power to make law. It had only the power to make recommendations to lawmakers around perspectives from Indigenous peoples, and it failed widely, ably supported by a huge misinformation campaign. It was called the No Vote. If you don't know, vote no. Australia is a very difficult jurisdiction to change the constitution. If we don't know, we vote no. And so that phrase was used a lot. We've had very few successful referenda. And this particularly was a very, very negative referendum process, also assisted by a poor education campaign by the government leading the proposal. What does this mean for Aboriginal children? Had we had a voice to Parliament, Aboriginal children's voices could have been represented in a way that is not able to be represented today. It could have led to, and Indigenous leaders have said this could have led to some very positive impacts for children and young people in Australia. Not all Indigenous people wanted the voice. The progressive Indigenous movement actually wanted treaty before voice. But in 2017, we had a gift from Aboriginal people called the Treaty from the Heart. And again, that was rejected initially, and that called for voice, treaty, and truth in that sequence, actually. And so it's a big shame that the voice referendum failed. In terms of the implementation of the CRC in Australia, there has been some progress. For example, the National Children's Commissioner, that role has been instituted. That's something that the Committee on the Rights of the Child really urged Australia to do, and that's been in place for quite some time now. We also have the Joint Parliamentary Commission on Human Rights, which has to examine all prospective legislation for its human rights compliance before it is passed. And then just this year, we've had some fundamental changes to the Family Law Act. There are many changes to that, and it was very overdue. But one of the key changes for Indigenous children is the recognition of family kinship care. So that is a very important change. However, way back in 2013, John Tobin, a very well-known children's rights scholar, he said the following words of Australia's implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. He said, "There has been no attempt to comprehensively import this international instrument into Australian domestic law." And that's still the case now. A Human Rights Act, however, could change this. If we had a Human Rights Act that incorporated children's rights, if we had a National Children's Act alongside the Human Rights Act, this could be a very fundamental change in Australia's legal landscape, and it could have the potential to alter the ways that we are removing children into the child protection system and into the juvenile justice system. The next slide considers the Committee on the Rights of the Child's assessment of Australia's latest report under our treaty reporting obligations. And at this meeting, the UNCRC repeatedly criticised Australia's very poor record, noting in particular the failings of the child protection system and the fact that the age of criminal responsibility, in their words, is bewilderingly low. It's 10. Yeah. And so you can see how having such a low age of criminal responsibility funnels the most marginalised into judicial response rather than non-judicial responses. And so there are concerted efforts to change that, and 3 states in Australia are looking to do that quite soon and have made promises about that. But there is this oscillation between the commitment to do that and not to do that. So we're hoping for change soon. Australia is duty bound, however, by the convention to progressively realise Indigenous children's rights, but the opposite is happening. And the slide shows a key report called the Family Matters Report of 2023. This is the peak body for Indigenous children. And this is called SNAKE. The peak body is called SNAKE. They have projected in this report that the number of Indigenous children in care, in out-of-home care, so those who've been taken from country, from family, will increase by 50% in the next decade. Now, this is an alarming statistic. This is an alarming projection, and one that we need to take action to prevent. In the absence of a national charter of rights, we actually have some charters of rights across some jurisdictions. But really, we've got to question the value of those charters because they actually haven't really stopped abuses against Aboriginal children. And some jurisdictions, so Victoria, a state in Australia, they've had a Charter of Rights for some 20 years. On the other side of this slide, you'll see the Najadi report. This report says, "Hear me, Youth Voices Creating Change for Justice." And this report details egregious breaches of Aboriginal children's rights in out-of-home care and in juvenile justice. And it talks about chronic systemic abuse, structural discrimination, and ongoing systemic failures to protect Aboriginal children's rights. And of concern, in 2023, the Queensland government overrode their own Human Rights Act in order to allow adult watch houses. So these are adult watch houses, often in police quarters, to be used to incarcerate children with adults in inhumane and very degrading conditions. There are reports of young Aboriginal people sleeping in a shower recess, for example, and hearing and being very close to adult prisoners within these watch houses. This is only last year, and this is going on right now. And in order to imprison children in these watch houses, the Queensland government overrode their own Human Rights Act. So you've got to question, what is the purpose of a Human Rights Act if there isn't political will or resourcing or anything else to support the non-incarceration of Aboriginal children and young people? Some years ago, I had the true honour of speaking with Aboriginal children in the Northern Territory. And through this research, I learned a lot about how young Aboriginal people want to be listened to and how young Aboriginal people haven't had the opportunity to be listened to. In 2007, the Conservative Liberal government at the time instituted the Northern Territory Emergency Response. Now, this was a response to a report called the Little Children Are Sacred report that came out saying that many Aboriginal children experience sexual abuse, that many Aboriginal children experience poverty, many Aboriginal children are unsupported by governments. The government at the time picked up sexual abuse and then publicised on all media outlets this notion that Aboriginal children experience sexual abuse. So therefore it justified an emergency response where quite literally 600 ADF, so Australian Defence Force personnel, went in uniforms and basically shut down communities, 73 communities across the Northern Territory, implementing emergency measures under international human rights law. To do that, the federal government suspended the Racial Discrimination Act, a federal act that says you can't racially discriminate on the basis or institute racially targeted laws. They set aside that act in order to put in place the Northern Territory intervention, where 73,000 Aboriginal people were then subjected to a range of very draconian measures. And that's only stopped in 2022. That went on for a long time. So we're seeing the effects of the intervention. What children said to me about the effects of the intervention was that the intervention shamed their communities, that it did nothing for their rights, that perhaps there were some different services available, but ultimately it shamed their communities. Instead, they said, "Come and see us, just ask us." And the title of my presentation today is indeed that. It is Ask Us, This Is Our Country. Hearing and responding to Indigenous children and young people's voices. And this is what Aboriginal children want. They want to be engaged in public policy and decision making, but yet don't have the opportunity to do so. Something wonderful happened in 2019. Aboriginal children met in the top end of Australia and they created the Imagination Declaration. And this was only 2 years after the Uluru Statement from the Heart was gifted to the Australian population in 2017. What I want to convey is that the child rights climate in Australia needs to do a complete U-turn. It needs to about face. But this would necessitate a radical reshaping of juvenile justice and child protection systems nationally, in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other international human rights law. Sana Nakata, a Torres Strait Islander scholar, says, children are never far from the political struggles of a nation. And I think that is very true. And what we need in Australia is a revolution in the ways governments interact with Indigenous communities. What is happening now is not working. What is the way forward? Young people, through the Imagination Declaration, have presented a way forward. We have a template. We are not starved of a way forward. And I'd like to share just a few words from this beautiful address that Sienna gave at the Gama Foundation meeting in 2019. Sienna, on behalf of the group of young people who designed this Imagination Declaration, said this. In 1967, that is the referendum, we asked to be counted. In 2017, through the Uluru Statement from the Heart, we asked for a voice and treaty. Today, we ask you to imagine what's possible. The future of this country lies in all our hands. We do not want to inherit a world that is in pain. We do not want to stare down huge inequality, feeling powerless to our fate. With 60,000 years of genius and imagination in our hearts and minds, we can be one of the groups of people that transform the future of life on Earth for the good of us all. We can design the solutions that lift islands up in the face of rising seas. We can work on creative agricultural solutions that are in sync with our natural habitat. We can re-engineer schooling. We can invent new jobs and technologies, and we can unite around kindness. We are not the problem. We are the solution, they said. Really powerful words, aren't they? So I want to also share a quote from a dear research collaborator, Byami Williamson, from another university in Australia called Monash, where he wrote straight after the failed referendum the following words. May each yes vote cast at the referendum be a drop of rain that nourishes the land as it seeks to heal itself. With concerted effort and sympathetic yet radical activism, October 14 may be remembered as the firestorm that tore through our nation, but from which green shoots of opportunity sprung. What I'd like to convey is that the passing of a Children's Rights Act and a Human Rights Act in Australia in conjunction is a green shoot of opportunity in the wake of the referendum defeat, and it could contribute to a rights revolution in Australia. So thank you very much.